Hello, this is America, currently at war with Iran. But did it come as a surprise? See, President Trump has framed this as inevitable, citing what he said was an imminent threat. He said Iran started this 47 years ago. But cast your mind back, not even a month, there were talks taking place to try to avoid a war. So was this always inevitable? Was the world always headed down this path? There is so much to unpack, starting with Anna Burns-Francis.
You're right, Phil. It was just 4 weeks ago that people were watching and waiting with bated breath to see how those diplomatic talks between the US and Iran would turn out. Now the world looks much different. In a moment, we'll be joined by our correspondents. Kimberly Halkett is live at the White House and Manuel Rapalo is live for us at the State Department. But first, cast your minds back to late February. The United States was deep in diplomatic negotiations with Iran. Whatever the exact detail of what was on the table, and there were several different viewpoints on this, Donald Trump seemed to be unhappy at the progress, or lack of, being made.
Look, wonderful if they negotiate really in good conscience, good faith and conscience, but they are not getting there.
You can't put up with it too long. We're not happy with the negotiation. They just don't want to. They don't want to say the key words, we're not going to have a nuclear weapon.
So maybe things had hit a stumbling block, but there was no indication that just 24 hours later the situation would have so markedly changed.
The United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated.
America was at war, and the president was about to discover why his predecessors chose not to try and destroy Iran, but rather tried to contain it. So what prompted Donald Trump to go from diplomacy to destruction? First, let's go to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, who joins us now. Kimberly, President Trump's messaging has been back and forth since this conflict even began. So what was the moment, do you think, that indicated that diplomacy was off the table?
Yeah, the clearest indication diplomacy was off the table came just days before the strikes. That's when the president's actions and his language finally aligned. The U.S. president had been saying up to that point that he wanted a deal, but the military buildup in the region was continuing, the exact opposite of diplomacy. It was when the president pivoted from that 10-day window for a deal to limit Iran's nuclear program and openly advocating for regime change to saying it was now too late to negotiate. So it's the combination of the forces in the area as well as the rhetoric that really let us know that diplomacy was failing. But when we finally realized that it had failed was when there was this evolution and the pressure went from shifting to pressure on Iran to dismissal of outright talks.
All right, Manny, I'll bring you in here because the next set of talks are said to be in the hands, once again, of the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. So what do we know about those negotiation efforts last time?
Well, Anna, President Trump had tapped Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner in those days and weeks leading up to the conflict to seek out a nuclear deal with Iran. And in those early days, there were positive signs. The U.S. officials had described those talks as being very positive. Iran's foreign minister had called it a good start. So behind the scenes, or actually publicly rather, the signaling was that diplomacy was still alive. Whatever was going on behind the scenes was clearly far more complicated. Both sides went into this, both the United States and Iran, with red lines that simply were not, neither of these countries was willing to negotiate on. And the criticism that we've heard from former diplomats is that here in the United States, the negotiating team lacked the technical nuclear expertise, specifically Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, to read Iran's bottom line, essentially setting this up to fail. And like you mentioned, Anna, at this point, what we're seeing is that those same individuals who were tasked with preventing the war, with preventing exactly the same scenario that we've seen play out over the course of the last 3 weeks, are now tasked with trying to contain it.
Thank you both. Kimberly Halkett from the White House and Manuel Rapalo from the State Department. Well, President Trump returned to diplomacy this week after backing away from a threat to strike Iran's power plants. saying productive negotiations were underway. The justification for Operation Epic Fury came after years of maximum economic pressure that Trump concluded had failed to stop Iran's nuclear progress. But those on the other side have warned the warfare undertaken risks a multi-generational cycle of violence that does nothing to bring a halt to the Iranian regime's ambitions.
President Donald Trump insists the war with Iran was inevitable.
It was my opinion that they were going to attack first. But if we didn't do what we're doing right now, you would have had a nuclear war and they would have taken out many countries.
Trump says Iran was weeks from reaching a nuclear weapons capability. But even within his administration, there was dissent.
The argument that there was an imminent threat, as in Iran was planning to attack us immediately, that just simply did not exist.
Kent and others argued for continued diplomacy, as previous U.S. administrations chose with Iran time and time again, including Barack Obama,
a deal that will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon,
who negotiated a nuclear agreement with Iran in 2015. The former Iranian embassy here in Washington has been closed for more than 4 decades. It stands as a reminder to just how long diplomacy between the two countries has been broken. Past presidents didn't trust Tehran, but they worried that with war, Iran could attack regional allies, disrupt global oil supplies, and drive up global prices. All of those things have happened in the current war. To avoid that, they chose diplomacy.
The alternative to the deal that we have reached is not what I've seen some ads on TV suggesting disingenuously. It isn't a, quote, better deal, some sort of unicorn arrangement involving Iran's complete capitulation. That is a fantasy.
I got him before he got me.
On Capitol Hill, some Democrats, still angry that Trump declined to seek congressional approval to declare war, insist the current air war cannot achieve Trump's goals without a drawn-out conflict.
Kinetic strikes, airstrikes, doesn't get rid of the IRGC. It doesn't obliterate or eliminate, this enrichment capability. So, again, my concern is an escalation, a wider war.
Critics say the solution to end the current conflict and avoid a wider war is to return to Trump's pre-war strategy, diplomacy. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Was the war avoidable? Both sides will tell you yes. But as always, it depends on who you're asking or what you're reading. Let's go back to Phil in the newsroom.
Sides are trying to put their own take on this, basically saying, look, we tried to stop this war. We were in the right. It was the other guy that was responsible. So let's see how that's playing out in the US media. We're going to start with Fox News. This is obviously one of Donald Trump's favorite, if not the favorite network, which means they get a lot of access to top administration officials. And there's one, Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, who was talking to Sean Hannity. Remember, he was involved in the negotiations before the strikes, and he was telling Hannity, basically, we bent over backwards to help Iran, and Iran just didn't want to know.
We had a red line on enrichment. However, we were willing to help them convert to a civil 1-2-3 non-enrichment program. And what you're referring to is, as a little extra, we suggested to them that we would provide fuel to them for free for a long period of time. And their response to that, you would think they would feel that that was something gracious. But their response to us was that this was an assault on their dignity.
Let's flip that around and we'll go to CBS News. This is Face the Nation. That's its host, Margaret Brennan. She was talking to Iran's foreign minister, and she put that very issue of uranium enrichment to him. Here's what he had to say.
I offered, actually, that we are ready to dilute those enriched material or downblend them, as they say, into lower percentage. So that was a big offer, a big concession, in order to prove that Iran has never wanted nuclear weapons and would never want them.
Are you willing to give that up now?
Well, there is nothing on the table right now.
Next up, it is the New York Times, which basically leans into this being something that didn't have to happen, but did happen anyway. Look, there's the headline in the NYT. For Trump, the Iran attack is the ultimate war of choice, the key word there. And it goes on to add this. It says there was no immediate threat from Iran, but the president saw a chance to push a weakened government over the edge. And if you head to the opinion section, it talks about the people around President Trump. It says he has relied for advice on a smaller circle of aides than past presidents did when ordering military action, and eschewed the careful process intended to call attention to objections and potential problems. Next up, it is CNN. Now, CNN held a town hall with Mike Waltz. You remember, he is the former national security advisor, is now the US ambassador to the United Nations. And here's a summary of what he said. President Donald Trump gave diplomacy a chance before deciding enough was enough and resorting to military action against Iran. Now, that is something that is contradicted if you head over to the Tucker Carlson show. This is obviously a conservative-leaning show. And remember this guy. This is Joe Kent. So he is the top intelligence official. You remember he resigned last week saying there was no immediate threat from Iran. He gave a long interview to Tucker Carlson, and he says, look, this basically was always the plan.
The planning for this was so compartmentalized that there was no debate, as in it was a foregone conclusion. Maybe the exact timing they weren't exactly aware of, or that had to be debated. When do we do it? But it seemed to be a foregone conclusion.
There is debate now, but that debate's centering on how this will end and when it will end. Both sides clearly want to find a solution, but they want to be the ones to say it ended on their terms, and they had the upper hand.
So was it poor planning or predetermined? To discuss this and more, joining me now is David Des Roches, former Pentagon Director of Arabian Peninsula Affairs, and Alan Eyre, Fellow at the Middle East Institute and former senior US diplomat. David, I'll start with you. Was going to war the right decision?
Oh, well, we won't know that for a few years. I think that you could argue, you could make a very strong case given Iran's predetermined decision, it appears, to attack neutral GCC states, neutral civilian shipping, and that their missile range appears to be longer than thought, much longer than thought, that it may have been, very well have been the right choice. But then, you know, looking at the global economic disruption, who knows? But I think that President Trump's statements that Iran is a threat to regional security and all that, I think that people in the region who used to be agnostic about that agree with him now.
I think it's fair to say it has played out that way. The argument seems to be as to how imminent that threat was. And Alan, if I can ask you, there seemed to be a breakdown, one of the arguments being that Marco Rubio said, you know, we knew that Israel was planning something or that there was an imminent threat from Iran. So what went wrong with the talks that turned it into a military operation?
Well, there never really was serious negotiations bilaterally. Both sides were going through the motions, but it was more accurate to characterize it as desultory, intermittent conversations as opposed to serious and sustained negotiations. So diplomacy was never given a chance by either side.
Because of a lack of commitment to the talks or a lack of interest, or as some have criticized, a lack of willingness or understanding of the situation?
A variety of reasons. I think one key factor was that the United States administration miscalculated, thinking that because Iran was weaker than ever, it would be easier to accept the maximalist U.S. demands in negotiations, whereas the opposite was true. Because Iran was weaker than ever, it was less likely to cut a deal with the United States that the U.S. would accept. So in reality, the two sides were never even close to a deal.
Okay, so if they were that far apart, David, was military action the only other option on the table?
Well, it's never the only other option on the table. But, I mean, the key factor about the talks was that Iran confined them just to the nuclear issue. Basically, they wanted the talks to be how to get to where we were in 2016. I viewed that agreement as a mistake because we gave up our one element of leverage, which was sanctions, for one consideration of Iranian policy, the nuclear issue, leaving proxies, leaving missiles, leaving hostages and human rights to be resolved later, and they were never resolved. So it struck me that this was just a pro forma thing. I think it was a requirement for Trump to show partners in the American public that he was making an effort, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. And the Iranians kind of felt that, well, as long as we're talking, we won't get attacked, so let's just spin this out. But there was no real concessions that made any sense, I think, in terms of our overall policy aims.
Can we talk about those talks? I saw you raise your eyebrows there, Alan. Would you like to? You were one of those negotiators that were involved in those talks. So what do you have to say about those criticisms?
Well, I've heard them before, and certainly a deal where all of Iran's putatively troubling behavior, nuclear missiles, repression of its own people, proxy network, a deal solving all of those would have been better by definition. But diplomacy is the art of the possible. And the most exigent threat to the United States and to U.S. national interests was Iran's nuclear program. So the thinking was, we deal with that first. We prove the theory of the case, the model could work, that you can actually negotiate with Iran about something, and then other issues could possibly be tackled in the future.
When you look, though, at where things progressed to after that, and OK, the deal was ripped up, and at that point Iran stepped back as well and said, well, if we're not subjected to it, then no need to stick to it. If economic sanctions for years didn't work and diplomatic talks didn't work, what was the alternative? And David said, well, war's never the only alternative. What would have been the alternative for you in this situation?
Well, I don't agree with your characterization that sanctions didn't work. Sanctions is what brought Iran to the table. It's not going to get enough to get them to capitulate and to agree to terms that they think are against their own national interests. But diplomacy, I mean, first of all, sometimes there is no solution. It's a peculiarly American misconception to think that every problem has a solution. For example, now there is no solution. Diplomacy is not feasible. Back then it was feasible, but it takes time. It's a slow, organic process. We hadn't talked to Iran diplomatically for decades. So there was no muscle memory. We had to start the process. But you're right, not everything can be solved with diplomacy, but nothing can be solved without it.
Omani negotiators were tasked with mediating those talks between America and Iran pre-war, and they seemed quite optimistic that a resolution was within reach.
Really, I can see that the peace deal is within our reach.
Can you get this complicated of a deal done quickly? You said you need 3 months. What do you need to accomplish this in 3 months?
No, I said that a deal actually can be agreed tomorrow.
Those same negotiators appeared completely caught off guard when the next day the US abandoned talks and embarked on its aggressive assault with Israel. I am dismayed, says Oman's foreign minister. Neither the interests of the United States nor the cause of global peace are well served by this. I urge the United States not to get sucked in further. David, goodness, sucked in further is quite strong language there. What do you make of that?
It's particularly strong for an Omani. I mean, I've never heard an Omani government official directly say anything negative about any other person or country. You know, let me agree with Alan. Diplomacy can't solve every problem in the world. And let me take exception with one of your earlier remarks. Oman wasn't mediating talks. The Iranians refused to be in the same room with the United States. They were passing messages back and forth. So you have to question how serious this process is when you're not even willing to be in the same room with the person you're supposedly negotiating with. I mean, I think that the constraints of what the Iranians were willing to talk about, combined with President Trump's state of mind, which was not being driven by the nuclear program or the missiles or the proxies, it was being driven by the massacres in January, where he got out over his skis and said, we're going to do something to support you. That's really what created the impetus that moved us along here. And it was clear that there wasn't anything other than what he did that he felt would move the ball further to addressing that promise he made to support the protesters and ultimately avenge them.
Can I pick up on that point there, Alan? Because if we accept that failed talks have then led to this war and therefore emboldened the regime has been one of the things that has come out of some of the commentary, does that make Iran closer to a nuclear deal and further away from a regime change?
Oh, I think regime change is out of the... I mean, the regime has already changed. Unfortunately, it's become more militaristic and more hardline. So we've already done regime change. If the late Ayatollah Khamenei had died in bed peacefully, his son would not be the supreme leader now. Okay? So Iran's not emboldened. Their back is to the water on the beach, and in their minds, they're fighting for their lives, which is why they're willing to fire off missiles and rockets and attack Gulf countries whose friendship or at least neutrality they need desperately. Okay? So Iran is, again, fighting for its continued existence in its own life, which is why it's taking these extreme measures. So again, diplomacy at this point, I think is very good to be very tough because, again, by all indications, the U.S. demands are even more maximalist, whereas Iran, the hardliners in charge now, are even less likely to accommodate U.S. demands.
Help me understand a bit, David, in terms of strategy. If diplomatic talks fail, if you decide that an airstrike campaign or a military campaign is the next step, is it normal or is it best practice to then have a return to diplomatic talks? And Alan is already perhaps a little pessimistic that there's any off-ramp in that manner, or should this really have been seen to an end of a conflict and we are now going back round in a circle that possibly is set to fail?
So with strategy, you look at all the elements of national power. And what throws a lot of people off about Donald Trump is he actually favors the economic element of national power. So I think his theory of regime change is not that we defeat the Iranian military and then put somebody in that's acceptable to us. It's that we eliminate Iran's ability to use military power against us by destroying the nuclear program, the missile program, whatever. But then regime change is going to come from economic power, maximum pressure. And that will lead the Iranians to choose somebody else. And if it's a hardliner who has to do that, that may be actually more lasting because we always have this debate as to whether the moderates are actually empowered or if they're just there to wrangle the Yankees. And anyhow, that's his theory of victory, is the economic power will do it, and it won't be done here. It's important to note that Israel does not share that view. So once the military campaign is done, there's going to be a split over strategic imperatives between Israel and the United States.
That's a whole other can of worms, isn't it? Alan, if then, on that basis, if this was advice on how to negotiate with Iran or how to get Iran to the table, obviously they are still saying that they are not anywhere near having talks in the second round, how do you negotiate with Iran?
You know, Dave was quite right, that the Iranians had this ridiculous theory that because we don't trust the U.S., we won't negotiate with them directly. That's nonsense. Both sides, neither side, in my opinion, gave negotiations a fair chance. I mean, ideally, you put two sides in a room, backed up by the requisite technical experts. The U.S. never had any technical expertise in-house available to it, and you just keep them there. You know, when we were doing nuclear negotiations with Iran, we would spend days and weeks in the same place every day from morning until night, meeting at the, at the principal level, at the technical level, working group level, hammering out details. Okay, so there has to be dedication. But as I said earlier, that's a necessary but not sufficient condition in this case.
Just quickly before I ask you a question, David, does that mean 5 days is a realistic window to expect any kind of meaningful development here?
Yeah, way too short. I mean, in 5 days you could agree to a ceasefire, but it's not in the Iran's interest to agree to a ceasefire because the only leverage they have is pressure on the Strait of Hormuz.
And so ceasefire is obviously not something that's been negotiated at this point, David. Is military action justified if it does get you to the diplomatic talks to that next stage?
Well, military action can support diplomatic talks, and I think that President Trump's autobiography was not the art of national power; it was the art of the deal.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, but I think he views the military power. I think he views that ultimately there'll be a deal with somebody, and military power's role is to ensure that he enters the negotiations from a position of strength. I think that's what it comes down to. And what he's finding out is that he's dealing with this sort of diffuse, people aren't attacking him, they're attacking neutral states, but that's having an effect here. So there's a little bit of confusion, and what compounds it is, Trump is aware, and the Iranians are aware, that there's a ticker here, that there's midterms coming up, that market disruption will work in their favor. So,
and that the strait is closed, and every day the strait is closed is pressure on a whole lot of countries.
Exactly, yeah. So, one side just wants to prolong it. The other side is looking to strike a knockout blow and is steadily eroding the military capacities of the Iranian state, both externally and internally. But the question is, will you see a failure of the security apparatus of the Iranian state, or will you see market failure that leads to political dissent in a Western democracy? That's the question.
Before we go, can I ask Alan, and I will try and get to you as well, David, here, should there be a public accounting of what happened in that first round of diplomatic talks, that the people who were responsible for negotiating with Iran or having talks with Iran should be able to have a public hearing on what was discussed and why those talks failed?
I don't think that's necessary, no. I mean,
Don't you? Why not?
Because that's not the most important aspect right now. I mean, we can leave that to the historians in terms of whether Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner by themselves had the requisite experience and expertise to negotiate with the Iranians and what orders they were given. But that's not the primary cause of this war right now. The war was a political decision at the highest levels of the U.S. administration in conjunction with the Israeli government. So, you know, you can have committees to find out what went wrong and what is still going wrong, but that's not a priority.
Thank you both for coming in. Alan Eyre and David Des Roches, thank you. Right, the question of whether the war with Iran was avoidable has also been raked over online. Alex Baird has this roundup.
The White House setting its narrative in stone online, saying Iran refused to say yes to peace and made it clear its priority was buying time to build a nuclear weapon.
They chose this path of violence and destruction, and they are reaping the consequences of their horrible decision.
Senator Ted Cruz sticking to that same line, that Iran had been stringing the US along with talks and that now there's no more room for diplomacy. Conservative commentator Glenn Beck rallying behind Trump's decision to leave the negotiating table and go to war.
This is not Donald Trump of 2016. This president has proven to me that he understands peace through strength.
On the other side of the coin, the argument from journalist Murtaza Hussain on X saying the US is structurally incapable of doing diplomacy with Iran, repeatedly attacking mid-negotiation. And the self-proclaimed king of Instagram, Dan Bilzerian, saying Trump clearly doesn't actually want peace if he's attacking Iran during peace negotiations. That same view doing the rounds nearly a year ago, in July, just after the first US bombing of Iran. Political analyst Trita Parsi saying Trump was not only engaged in coordinated deception, but his entire diplomatic engagement was a deception. Back on Capitol Hill, Democrats in the House Foreign Affairs Committee demanding answers to work out how we got here and if this all could have been avoided.
Well, that's all from Washington, D.C. On This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the US and influence the world, particularly during the US and Israel's war with Iran. We'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, we'll hand back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha for continuing coverage of the US war in Iran. Thanks for joining us.